I'm Jean Mandernack, and today we're going to talk about questioning strategies that instructors can use to really help facilitate a lively, ongoing threaded discussion. One of the challenges when facilitating an online discussion is that all students are going to start with the same basic prompt, the same initial discussion question they're responding to. And as an instructor then, it becomes your job to take those initial posts and move the discussion forward in a cohesive fashion. Key to this is knowing where you want the discussion to go. The discussion needs to have a focused direction that's going to guide your feedback and your prompts to each student. This will prevent having kind of a disjointed discussion where you're prompting each student but without any real purpose. The key here is that the instructor needs to motivate the students to actively participate in the discussion. So while the faculty member may bring in information and content and examples, the real key is going to be to use those examples and use that content to motivate students to think more about the issues in the course. And using questions then to probe and move them up Bloom's taxonomy towards a higher level thinking skill. As Bloom's taxonomy originally put forth, there are various levels of knowledge. And it starts with that baseline level of understanding. And once students understand the concepts, they can then move forward to more advanced understanding, applying the information, bringing together various sources of information, and at the highest level, evaluating that information. As an instructor, your first step is to really analyze your discussion questions to see at what level are you starting the discussion. And is that appropriate? Because your first step may actually be to use some questioning strategies to go back and establish the previous knowledge base, or to really foster that low-level comprehension so that they can move the discussion forward. The second question then requires you to look at the learning goals of your course and the learning goals for that particular assignment and ask yourself, where realistically do I need to move the students according to Bloom's taxonomy? It's not appropriate in all courses, in all discussions, that you're going to try to get to an evaluative level. So you need to look at, for that course, for that discussion, what is the goal of this discussion? And then arrange your strategies around moving students towards that desired goal. Anderson and Krathwohl came out with a revised version of Bloom's taxonomy that really just changed Bloom's taxonomy from an emphasis on the cognitive objective, so the knowledge, comprehension, application, to an active verb-based model that says what you need to get students doing. So rather than establish knowledge, it says, you need to help students remember the information. Anderson and Krathwohl's revised version is not in contrast to Bloom's. Rather, it's a complementary model to try to see how we get students to reach those concrete cognitive objectives. What we're going to look at now is how do we use questioning at each of these various levels to help move students forward in their understanding. At the lowest level, we have remembering. And the key here is, what can you as an instructor do to help solidify the information in the student's mind? So it might be asking them to get information from the text. It might be asking them to bullet point information in a clear line to help them consolidate their understanding. It might be putting out a small example and asking them which of these components aligns with the terms and theories we're talking about. The key at this level, though, is bringing out the knowledge in a format that students are able to clearly understand, state, and recognize. Once students have this baseline level, the next step is to promote a more clear understanding. So now you would go on to ask them to explain the information, predict what would happen based on this information, perhaps asking them to summarize various viewpoints or restate the information in a slightly different fashion. In remembering, we talked about having them bullet list. Well, now you might actually have them convert the information, categorize it, and make a bullet list in new categories. So it's asking them to modify and adapt the information to show a more comprehensive understanding, not just relying on the ability to find and recall that information. At the next level is applying, and here's where you're going to want to integrate examples. asking students to show how this might apply, asking them to bring in examples from their own life. Or one of my favorites is to bring in examples from the media or from current events. So really telling them, take what you know in this course and let's manipulate the information. Let's apply this information to understand other context. So it's going beyond examples that are in the textbook or beyond examples you as the instructor provide to have students work to manipulate and utilize the information. At the next level is analyzing, and this is where we make the shift to the higher order thinking strategies. So now you want students to start to really infer understanding, to infer potential consequences, to be able to criticize and start to compare and start to interpret information. Some of the strategies may be similar to previous levels. We've talked about the role of classification and categorization before. So here it might require a more sophisticated categorization strategy. Rather than relying on surface level characteristics, maybe you're going to have them analyze, the underlying theories and classify according to those underlying theories. As an instructor, here's where you could start to point out discrepancies and tell students, look at so-and-so's post, compare that to so-and-so's post, analyze what is the key difference here? Why are their understandings different? So it's pushing students to go beyond any answer they could find in the textbook, to really think about the material. And the next level then is evaluating. And at the evaluation level, they would start to be able to defend and to argue and to draw conclusions. And it's not only the ability to say, I understand the information, but it's adding the component of whether or not they agree with it, whether they think that information had a valid basis. It's completely appropriate at this level of understanding to say, yes, that study told us X, but was it a good study? Should we be paying attention to the findings that we have? Or looking at a theory in the textbook and saying, let's go back and look at the research that led up to this theory. Is it good research? How do we judge the value and importance of this research? So really now it's going even beyond an understanding, and a sophisticated understanding at that, to ask them to use that understanding from a critical consumer perspective to place a value judgment on whether or not that knowledge is good. And then at the highest level is creating. Now using this comprehensive understanding to do something. So in a discussion thread, you might ask students, based on what you know and based on what you understand, create a plan of attack or a model that could capture how we could use this information in some kind of a meaningful format. Throughout all of these discussion prompts, there's an underlying theme that we want students to be the critical thinkers, that we don't necessarily care that they can regurgitate information in isolation, as long as when they can regurgitate that information, they can make it meaningful, they can understand the value or relevance. So one of the things you're going to want to do is ensure that the critical thinking questions that you integrate promote students to go beyond answers that they can find or answers that they can retrieve. There are various ways that you can do that, and we're going to look at a model put forth by Paul, really focusing on the range of critical thinking strategies. At the lowest level, again, this aligns back with Bloom's taxonomy, he said, we need to establish that there is a baseline level of knowledge. Paul referred to this as the clarification stage, and it could include questions like, what do you mean by? Or how would you summarize that main point? Give me an example to explain that further. Directly calling out students and saying, can you summarize what so-and-so said? And then going back to that other person and saying, is this summary reflective of what you really meant? The goal here would be to get a firm foundation in knowledge, but not simply having students repeat it back to you as the textbook says it, but having them put it in their words to establish that they clearly do have a grasp of that base level knowledge. Moving on up then would start to be exploring the issue, trying to look at it as a multidimensional concept. So what do we know? What does this assume? How do we break it down? What are the component parts? What other things is this tied to? From a real concrete perspective, even asking students to relate information in one chapter to information they've talked about in other chapters, but trying to see that each of these concepts, or theories don't occur in isolation, that issues are interconnected. Moving on up the line then is to start to probe their assumptions, asking how their viewpoints impact their understanding, having them explore alternative viewpoints and alternative explanations, and looking at how our own personal assumptions influence the way we make sense of information. Then going on to look at how much faith we put in the other explanations, asking, what are the reasons and why do you have these reasons? Are the reasons adequate? Is the evidence adequate? What evidence exists on both sides of the viewpoint? And then, how can we find out if these reasons or evidence are even true? How much support do we give for the evidence that's been provided? Looking also at, where does this information come from? Is it based on personal experience? Is it based on fact? Is it based on a single study? Is it based on a theory? But asking students to look at where the source of information comes from and to start to make evaluative judgments about how much faith they should put in information depending on what its origin is. And then finally probing, what are the implications and consequences? What would it mean if that was true? What are the alternatives, and what would it mean if the alternatives were true? Looking at the comparison between different theories or different concepts, or looking at research studies that show contradictory evidence on the same topic, having students look at why those contradictions might exist and how, as critical thinkers, we can help to start resolving that, to resolve those discrepancies. And then looking at that broader perspective. Is this a universal understanding? Do other people view this the same way? How would other people respond? How would a different perspective provide different information on the topic? As an instructor, you can serve as that devil's advocate to say, what if? In many cases, saying what if and posing a hypothetical question can promote students to think about those other perspectives, or moving back down the line, to help defend and solidify their own perspective and provide evidence and reasoning for that. As you're moving throughout these discussions, in many cases you're going to want to integrate other information to help stimulate the discussion. And there are a range of sources to help stimulate these different questions. You can use current events, things that you've read in the newspaper, things that you've seen on TV or on the news, bringing that in and tying it into what's happening at class and asking students, based on their course understanding, how do we explain this? Or what do we predict is going to happen? Or how do we use theories to explain how we even got to this point? Within any field of investigation, there's often controversial topics. So as an instructor, you can bring those controversial topics into the discussion, provide students with some guidance on where they can find information supporting both of those topics, and then asking them, which side do you agree with? Why? What is your evidence? What was the support that each side had? And having students work through those controversies, recognizing that in many cases, even the most knowledgeable scientists don't necessarily agree. You can go back to your textbook. In many cases, they provide review questions. You can modify those review questions to help students summarize and solidify some of that knowledge. Or go back to the chapter prologue and see what are the learning goals for this chapter. And have I, through this discussion, managed to get to the level of thinking I was aiming at? And using the prologue as a source of identifying what those key issues are. Going back to the assigned readings, asking students to clearly relate their own thoughts and opinions to things in either the online readings or the textbook, but having students go beyond just providing their ideas and opinions to the next step of supporting them, tying them back, and providing a more sophisticated viewpoint. One of my favorite strategies is to do website reviews. I will actually have students respond to the initial question, and then I'll come back and say, but here's what I found on this website. Please go take a look at this website and come back and tell me, why are there differences? What do you think? Does this change your opinion? To having students look at information that's readily available to them and clearly be able to start to evaluate that from a higher order thinking level. You can bring in case studies. You can even, have students kind of create their own case study examples as they go to support their points. Or you can have students do online searches. So in many cases, I'll have students repeatedly, telling me a theme of their thoughts or their opinions, and I'll say, take the key words from that. Do a Google search and come back and tell me, does the scientific community agree with you? Are there other things out there to support your position? If so, why do you think we got to this point? If not, what is different about your position compared to what's readily available on the internet? So as the instructor, you just need to think about, how do I get students to think further? How do I get students engaged in the discussion so that they want to come back and continue the questioning process? What the research has told us is critical thinking is not unique to any mode of delivery. There's not necessarily differences between face-to-face classes and online classes in terms of how well students learn to think. The difference is in how an instructor facilitates and encourages the discussion. Instructors that can effectively encourage students to think about concepts and to come back and to clarify and to seek additional information have students that show greater learning gains and greater levels of critical thinking than instructors that are passively responsive or maintain that low level on Bloom's taxonomy in just seeking the clarification and the textbook ties to the information. So as an instructor, then your challenge is to be able to identify what's the goal of my discussion, and then how do I use questioning strategies to get students actively move towards that desired level of interaction. There's a lot of research published on this topic, and I encourage you to take a look at the research if you have a chance. Or you're also welcome to email, call, or engage me in further discussion about how we can use questioning strategies to promote ongoing discussion in the online classroom.